senior editor at Mother Jones, author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Michael Mechanic. Michael, welcome to the program. I'm here with Emma Vigeland.
All right. Thanks, Sam. Good to be here.
So, all right, let's just start. Like, how did you decide to engage in this project? It's a fascinating world in which these folks live in, but it's also, I don't know, sometimes I find it gross, frankly. But how did you decide to look into this, and what was the idea behind it?
Well, I had the initial idea like 2 decades ago. I was just sort of thinking the way we get obsessed with big lottery winners and sort of what happens to them, and the conventional wisdom is that their lives are ruined by it. Well, what really happens to them, and have we ever heard, deeply from them about this? So I thought you'd write a book called Jackpot, and each chapter would kind of be the experience of a different person who had come into great wealth. And that was really impractical because I didn't do it. It was backburnered. It was one of those kinds of ideas, but it would have been impossible because lottery winners, they go completely off the radar. They cut off all communications with the outside world pretty much. They're not going to talk. There's no way you're going to get enough to fill a book, certainly. And so I kind of put it on the back burner. And then one day I'm at Mother Jones, a literary agent calls me up. He'd been reading my stuff and liked it. He said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Well, actually, yeah." And we talked about it, and we kind of fleshed out the idea to kind of look at wealth obtained in various types of ways, not just the pure luck, but the building a company and selling it, or making a prescient investment, or things like this. There's a lot of different flavors of coming into wealth. And it seemed really timely now because we're at this moment of incredible, staggering wealth inequality in this country. And our system is set up to make that happen, essentially. So we decided it would be a good time to investigate that phenomenon.
It's interesting. And well, do me one favor. Will you move your microphone away from your shirt there for a moment?
All right. Yeah. Is it rubbing? Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting it rubbing in there. And so let me ask you this about the people because we'll get into this because you talk about like the money is the concentration of this wealth, and we'll get into that part of the book is has horrible impacts on society. In a myriad of ways, but it also hurts, or at least the people you're talking to. There's a lot of problems that they go through. Nobody makes the argument that it's better, that it's more fun to not have money necessarily, but the money. And I'm not convinced that necessarily a certain amount of money can't buy them happiness, but it does create certain psychological issues. But I wonder, do you think that also was skewed insofar as who would provide you access? In other words,
yes.
If I'm ambivalent about the amount of money I have and it's causing me problems and I want to tell somebody about it, you come along, I'm going to say yes. But if I'm one of those people who's like, I'd rather people not know exactly what I'm up to because I'm fine and I might not talk to you.
It's actually hard to know because there's people who have problems who wouldn't want to talk about it. And they say this is very private. And then there's people who have problems who are desperate to talk about it. But the fact is, it was hard to get people for this book because, money being such a taboo subject in our society. I mean, we love talking about it, but we don't like to talk about our own personal financial situation. It's like talking about your sex life, actually worse, right? So I got a lot of rejections. I mean, every billionaire puts you through their PR team, and the PR team says, "What's the upside to us?" And it's hard to give a good answer to that question. It's more like a societal view, and they always just say, "We think your book sounds great, but no thanks. We're not going to do it."
But that is sort of almost like incumbent in amassing that kind of wealth, right? Which is We're not so much in it for the societal view as much as we are in it for our amassing a fortune.
Yeah, but it also just sort of happens. You know, you're built the way the system is set up. You're building company, you're amassing wealth, and the wealth amasses more wealth. And whether you think that's a good thing or not, it's just sort of the way it happens. And the fact is, you get into this wealth management world where if you have so much money, it's really hard to manage it yourself unless you're a master investor, right? You have to hire people to kind of help you. You have this financial entourage, and their default is to minimize taxes and maximize returns for you. So unless you are on top of them to do, you know, social justice investing or equitable things, they're going to go that route, you know, and you're going to end up with ridiculous amounts of money. You know, in the wealth spectrum, there's people who go out of their way to sort of twist the system further to their advantage. And then there's people on the other end, like the patriotic millionaires, who are actually lobbying for more equitable tax policies and things like that. But most of the people are just sort of doing their thing in the middle. You know, it's not they're not necessarily bad people, but they have a lot of money, and that money is growing and growing. And sometimes they express some guilt about it. But you know, I had one guy say, you know, it's funny. I feel like I should be paying taxes and people should pay taxes. I believe in that. I think government has a big role. But then I go and I talk to my estate lawyer, and we're talking about how do I shield the most money as possible. He said, it's this weird disconnect, because when it comes to your own situation, all of a sudden, hey, that's my money.
Well, I feel like people in every walk of life, but as it pertains to what you wrote about in your book, choose to sanitize situations in order to, I guess, make themselves, I don't know, feel better or justify certain ways of living. Did you find that there was a whitewashing, I guess, of the ways in which this wealth was accumulated, or the fact that wealthy people are often a part of a system that they may, you know, critique from the outside, but that they're very much still a part of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think we all want to think we're good people, right? Wealthy or poor. Everybody wants to think of themselves as a good person. And when you see that you're benefiting from a very unfair system, it can conflict with that self-image. So I think there's a lot of denial. You know, like you said, Sam, there was some sort of self-selection, and the type of people who would actually talk to a journalist, let alone a Mother Jones reporter, right?
Right.
So I probably tended to get more liberally minded people than, you know, than conservative, like recluses, right? But there's certainly, I mean, they'll talk about that disconnect too. The people, my subjects, would talk about that disconnect. And there's a lot of people who won't. They're just in denial. You know, I spoke to a lot of people in the orbits of extremely wealthy people, and they say, I talk to these billionaires they just, you know, the system is fair. I'm self-made. Everything is fine. And why are you talking about this racial stuff that happened so long ago? You know, there's just a denial of reality as far as the way the playing field is slanted toward the very wealthy in this country.
That part of your book, I think, is really important, particularly in the context. I mean, just yesterday we played a clip of Bill Gates, you know, sort of casually talking about, well, look, I got this handled. I'm talking to the CEOs of the vaccination companies, and you know, more and more you see the impact that Bill Gates's money and supposed, and I don't want to get into, I want to get into the philanthropy, because I think that's sort of the most interesting part of what you're, but the psychology of these people is really important for people to understand, because guys like Bill Gates are considered like, they're so benevolent, and the giving pledge that we're going to give the money away, it largely it's irrelevant, their largesse, because the idea that they get to control these type of resources is very dangerous. And the idea that you are surrounded and untethered from the reality of, I mean, these people, it seems to me, operate like they're, I mean, like gods. I mean, the rules simply do not apply. Can you go through some of the stuff of like, you know, and I just, I had a buddy who I hadn't been in touch with for a while, and he had told me that he became, that he was working in the inner circle, not on the personal side, but on the business side of a billionaire. And he said, I know you think it's bad. It's worse. And he talked about like, there is no such thing as customs for billionaires. They land in the airport and they just walk through. They don't go through passport control. None of that applies. Like they just operate on a different plane. They're mad about something at the University of Pennsylvania. They pick up the phone and call the president in the way that you would, you know, with less hesitation than you would to call the cable company and tell them that your service is bad. Talk a little bit about that element of their lives.
Yeah, the access thing is huge. Access to anyone you want, people, politicians, celebrities, you know, and I think it has to get to your head after a while, right? The fact that you can just call your senator and they'll call you back, or you call the agent of some Hollywood celebrity, hey, can you come play at my party, hang out at my party? Sure, yeah. And one of the guys I was talking to, this is one of the most stupefying things of coming into the kind of money that I have, is everybody will call me back, you know, and that also you start giving money, you get in with the leaders of these organizations, and all of a sudden you're having dinner with the head of Conservation International, or you're having dinner with, you know, diplomats, and, you know, and Stanley McChrystal is coming to your neighbor's house to give a book reading. You're invited over there. You're invited to fundraisers, gives you direct access to political candidates. And all these things, I mean, psychologically, it makes you think I can have anything I want.
Because you can.
Because you can. And not only that, but the political attitudes of very wealthy people are different than the attitudes of the public. What they want is different than what the public wants on things like environment, for one. That was a big one. For obviously redistributive policies, the wealthy folks are not too happy about the wealth tax that Elizabeth Warren is proposing, or, you know, Biden's recent
capital gains.
Capital gains, yeah. In fact, Biden announced this morning or yesterday he wants $80 billion to beef up IRS enforcement on high earners, which have been, that's a little snippet of my book that's kind of interesting. It's 2010, it was like 23% of earners over $10 million were audited, and now it's like 0.3%. The IRS has been gutted, and it's almost, you can get away with anything.
And how aware, I mean, obviously the accountants that a billionaire, let's say, or 100 millionaire hires, they're all aware of this. And so that changes their behavior, right? Like 10 years ago, I wouldn't have taken this deduction or whatever it is, or I wouldn't have created this financial vehicle because there's a 1 in 5 chance that we're going to get audited. The chance is so low now that the risk reward calculation, I'm going to do it. If we end up having to pay a fine here, we pay a fine. I mean, all of this is operating. How much awareness is there between that team and the billionaire, or is it just you know, do you lose count of your money at that point?
I think so. On the other hand, you know, the billionaires these are all mostly business people. Some of them are inheritors, but many of them are people who have built companies. So they can be a little bit micromanaging. You know, they want to know what's going on with their finances. But yeah, the tricks that they're pulling, the tricks that they're pulling, even if they get challenged by the IRS, there's like this special tax court that none of us have ever heard of. And they send their lawyers to this tax court, and they usually can work out a deal, even if what they're doing is really quite fraudulent. And there's some cases of hedge funders and Wall Street banks recently doing something called basket options, which I didn't put in the book, but it's a total fraud. Just trying to, it's a tax scam, and they've been working on a settlement with the IRS. But this is like tens of billions of dollars in extra profits these guys got, and they're going to get their wrists slapped probably, or maybe they'll have to pay some penalties. But it's these guys are so rich it doesn't even matter to them.
Right.
Can you talk about this concept of wealth segregation and how that exacerbates a lot of the dynamics that you researched in your book?
Yeah, sure. So economists call it income segregation because it's really hard to measure people's wealth. We don't know what people have. We can tell by tax records what their income is. And so in a metropolitan area, especially where there's high income inequality, I call it wealth flight. Like the wealthy will concentrate in pockets and leaving the poor in pockets. And then you get these mixed income areas in the center where they're smaller and smaller, fewer and fewer people living in them. So you have the affluent over here, you have the less affluent over here, and you have the people in the middle. And what that does is it creates these bubbles where, you might hear your friend Bob is talking about his private jet that he just bought, or his yacht and his house in Aspen, and that's all normal, right? Most of us go to a party and people are talking about paying their mortgage, or their landlord threatening to evict them. But these guys, they live in this world where the concierge medicine and whatever, the elite private school. This is just, and what happens is when you live in that sort of element and you don't sort of see how other people struggle, there's a loss of empathy. And there's also distrust from both ends. These rich people are jerks. They're arrogant. They're clueless. And then the rich people are saying, "Who are those people over there? Oh, I don't know what they're up to. Maybe they're going to come and burn my house down." So you get this sort of tearing of social fabric. And I think that tearing of social fabric is evident in some of the social problems we see now, sort of the deterioration of civil society that we've seen in the past several years.
It reminds me of the complaint about the idea of a free college option, like that it would be horrible if a millionaire or billionaire's kid went to a free public college with everyone else, like as if that would be not. I mean, I would pay extra for that happening in society.
Yeah,
it would be healthy. But I want to just like focus on this before we move on to sort of like a couple other things. Is this this notion of being cloistered there and what it does in terms of the empathy. A longtime listener of this program told a story about Robert Rubin in a car. She had gone to some a fundraiser, and he happened to be sitting next to her and was complaining about his car ride to the place in a town car. He apparently got on the phone and called the mayor's office, got the complaining about the traffic. And she asked him, "Where were you?" And he goes, I don't know. I mean, he's in Manhattan, has no idea. He's complaining about the traffic, but he does not even where he is. Like, they're living on a totally different plane here. And you talk about this sort of being cloistered. There is this concept of acquired narcissism, which, and I have no experience with people of this kind of wealth, but I do have this experience with people who are, famous, who have achieved this level of fame, and you are in all of a sudden a bubble, and the ability to assess like what people just go through in their daily basis is just gone. And that has to inform everything you do in terms of your politics, right? I mean, were there people that you spoke to who you felt like thought they were really in touch, but completely oblivious?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was one guy I talked to was a private equity guy who goes and he gets what do you call it? Carried interest, right? Carried interest is for guys like that, for guys like Donald Trump, partnerships that do investments. It's a huge boon, hedge fund managers. And so this loophole just seems to last and last and last, and nobody's been able to kill it yet. Trump was talking about killing it when he was on the campaign trail. Hillary Clinton was talking about killing it. Of course, Trump wasn't going to kill it. because he benefits from it, as do a lot of his pals. So this guy said, I personally go with this group to Washington every year to lobby in favor of this. And he says, we tell him, oh, it's great for California. And then he says, BS. So he admitted it. He admitted that like it is BS. But he also said, I think he thinks the economic system is fair. And I don't know.
Well, of course he thinks that because he's done well by it. Right, exactly. How does it impact? I mean, you go into the sort of gender and race issues. I mean, what were the most salient points that you came across there? Obviously, we don't have an enormous amount of Black wealth in this country. There's not just simply not. There's not the communities of like billionaires that there are in terms of white people. Also true, I guess, with women as well. What implications of that at that level?
Yeah, we only have 7 Black billionaires. We should have something like 100. I can't recall the calculation, but
and you say we should have. That's,
well, I mean by population,
right? And I mean there's Homestead Act. I mean, there's a whole litany of things that we have done in this country to prevent Black people from gaining wealth,
and women for that matter. Because if you look at the global ultra wealthy people with 30 million and up, it's 9 men to every woman. Wow. And this is something I learned that I hadn't known. Until 1974, a woman could not get a bank loan without a man's signature on it. So if you were divorced, if you were widowed, if you were single, you couldn't get a loan to start a business. And actually access to capital throughout all these things, we say this is race discrimination, this is gender discrimination. It's all economic at its core. And it's because it's preventing people from getting money, from accumulating money. And with Black people in America, it's something that one of my sources refer to as the black tax, which started with slavery, which was the 100% black tax, all economic opportunities taken from you. And then after that, you talked about the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act started at the end of the Civil War. It's the biggest public to private land transfer, or actually wealth transfer, because land was the wealth then, in American history. And they gave away 160-acre parcels to anyone who would go and improve on them. But Black people, the law didn't say Black people could do this. But in reality, the way it was structured in the time and the difficulty of Black people in getting around and access to the process, it was something like 1.4 million white families and only 5,000 Black families got land. And that land was the basis of intergenerational wealth. That's what you left to your children. So that was a huge thing. You have all these things throughout our history where the federal government has boosted white wealth and left Black folks on the side. The housing stuff that we all know about, all the
right.
federal backing of housing loans. You couldn't get a home loan until the late 60s or 70s if you were Black. You were kept out of communities because there were racial covenants. And the white communities were built up at taxpayer expense. The Black communities were ignored. And you get some of the same capital issues even now, both if you're Black or you're a woman trying to get venture capital funding or trying to get a bank to give you money to start a company. It's much higher bar.
Right. And of course, all of this is not to say that there should be more Black billionaires. There should just be less billionaires, if any, as far as I'm concerned. None should not exist. At one point, I sat on a panel with, his name escapes me at the moment, but he was a big, I think he owned BET, and he's one of the
Robert Johnson.
Yeah.
Robert Johnson.
No, maybe it wasn't then. It wasn't, maybe he didn't own BET. Maybe it was a different guy. It wasn't Robert Johnson. I can't remember his name. But I sat on a panel with him, and he's saying that the the Congressional Black Caucus wanted to get rid of the estate tax or something to that effect. And the idea was to build, Black intergenerational wealth. And I was like, well, wait a second. That's maybe we shouldn't do it that way because that's just going to benefit you. I can't remember exactly what who he was. Peebles or something to that effect. He was a
that sounds familiar.
And but nevertheless, so let's move to this question of philanthropy, because we've talked about philanthropy on this program in many ways. But how do these wealthy people perceive of their charitable givings, and why? Let's get into the part of where it harms the all of us. I mean, obviously, the fact that they have more access to politicians, highly problematic. You cite the Gillen's research on whenever there's any type of controversial issue, it is the wealthy people who have Congress decides in favor of. How else does it hurt us?
Well, when you have essentially taxpayers subsidize philanthropic giving. Now, if you accumulate money, especially if you accumulate it in questionable ways, you underpay your workers, you fight against policies that would help the middle class and try to enrich yourself, and you amass all this money, and then you give back as some sort of grand sort of salve for some of the problems that you helped to create. It's sort of reputation burnishing. And the trouble is not philanthropy per se, because philanthropy is desirable. There's always going to be gaps that the government can't fill in, that private interests can fill in. However, the degree to which philanthropy is presenting itself as a solution to society's problems, I mean, it gives these incredibly wealthy people incredible power over decisions that affect all of us, and no accountability, no ability to elect someone to make decisions for us. It's just, this guy wants to do this. He has the money, he's going to do it. When Rockefeller went before Congress, the John D. Rockefeller, he was trying to set up the first large general purpose foundation. He had to get a bill from Congress to charter it. He was ridiculed. Everyone said, "Are you kidding me? Like, this is just a power grab. You just want to have all this." So he went back to New York State and got it done in New York State. And, and Congress had a chance to actually put some accountability on foundations, and they blew it. And now foundations have very little accountability. They only have to pay out 5% of their total assets every year. That's one of the few requirements of a foundation. But look at the way the stock market is growing. These guys have endowments. They're growing 20, 30, 40% in a year. In fact, the billionaire wealth just from the pandemic, it's gone up $1.6 trillion, 55% since the beginning of the pandemic. So the people on the Giving Pledge, people who signed the Giving Pledge, they're much richer than when they signed that thing.
Right. Well, let me ask you this about the foundations. I mean, because to me, these things function, it seems to me, as private governments, completely undemocratic governments, because they have the ability, and I've been harping on it for quite some time. Bill Gates completely altered the trajectory of education in this country to the worse. I mean, by their own assessment, when the Rand Corporation assessed the Gates Foundation and all the Gates work in education 2 or 3 years ago, they wrote, "Yeah, no, we were wrong. We shouldn't have done any of this stuff." And that's high stakes testing. That's value added measure of teachers. It is privatization measures. And by all accounts, they're doing the same thing with vaccinations. Today, we see that COVAX, which was wholly a Bill Gates sort of driven initiative, is missing the mark. They're going to fail to provide the vaccinations, the meager 20% of they were supposed to provide vaccination for the 20% most poor in the world. They're not going to miss that. And all they've managed to do is to basically prevent the ability of other countries to produce these vaccines. That's, to me, where like the worst part about this. I mean, it's, yes, they're escaping taxation, but on these foundations, the idea that they build their endowments, do they, and they only have to pay out 5%, the money that they build in their endowments, does that actually, does that become a deduction for the owners of these foundations? I mean, if they raise $300 million in the, in the stock market with their endowment, let's just say, and then they deploy that $300 million, we're going to spend $100 million on malaria nets. Do they get credit? Do they deduct that on their own taxes in some fashion, or is this maybe just a far too simplistic notion?
Well, they don't pay taxes. Oh,
right.
You mean the person who started the fund? No, but
the people who started the fund.
The charities and the foundations are all tax exempt. So
right.
They take a big deduction when they put money into the foundation in the first place. And then the foundation, that money grows with no capital gains. So, and the fact that they're paying out 5%, I mean, because when people make charitable donations, the taxpayers subsidize that because there's a charitable deduction. So we're paying like a fifth or more of the cost of this, and then they sit on the money. Well, it's like we're sitting on all this dry powder that is tax subsidized. And so this is actually our money that is bound up at someone else's whim, and they can spend it as they like. I mean, I use the example, a simple example in the book is if you don't itemize your deductions, you can't take a charitable deduction. If you take the standard deduction, in other words, on your taxes, you can't take a charitable deduction. So if I take the standard deduction, I make a $1,000 donation to Feeding America, I pay $1,000. If Bill Gates does the same thing, if his effective tax rate is 25%, then he only pays $750. So taxpayers I'm subsidizing Bill Gates' giving. And he has, I think it's fine that Bill Gates gives away a lot of money, but I don't need to be subsidizing that, nor do you, nor do lower income people.
I'm not even sure I like the idea that he's giving away a lot of money because, I am more happy with the U.S. government saying, guess what we're going to do? We're going to take away your wealth above X amount of dollars. I don't know what it is at this point, but because when he deploys his money, it is so large that it's political power. Right. And it is not just political. I mean, it is societal power. It is a power that we can't even, he has the ability to make sure that there was no open source vaccine. I mean, that is not, I'm subsidizing his ability to do that. That's almost the least of the problem that we have as a world because of that. It's inhibiting. He has not been elected to anything. He is not even representative of a country that has elected people to anything. He has just made a unilateral decision based upon how much money he has that there's not going to be open source vaccine, period. End of story. He has the resources in which to make that happen in the same way that a country would, but more so in many respects, because he doesn't have the constraints of any type of accountability for this.
Yeah, well, remember when I talked about Rockefeller getting a bad reception from Congress? People, members of Congress, and President Teddy Roosevelt, former President Teddy Roosevelt, was saying what you're saying right now. But now we don't think that way anymore in this country. And
why?
I actually asked that question to Rob Reich, who wrote a book called Just Giving, where I learned a lot of these things. And he said, well, we have this marketplace mentality, this sort of neoliberalism. We've started to conflate, market performance with like goodness, and we revere our captains of industry, and we look up to these people, and the mentality has changed in this country since then. We forget how undemocratic big philanthropy is, or we just maybe generations have passed and we've forgotten. But it's always been undemocratic, and it could be reformed so it's not. But the way it's set up in this country, it sure is.
What would that look like, where we would have more public control of these foundations?
You could put conditions on foundations. You could force them to pay down their entire endowment over 50 years. You could certainly, actually there was a drive to increase it during the COVID, to 10 or 15% payout. And then donor advised funds, you don't have to pay out anything. So billionaires will just park their money in donor advised funds And it's great you set aside money for future giving, but they're doing it as a tax deduction, and then it's literally just sitting in this fund growing with nobody telling them to do anything with it. Like they can just have it sitting there. And these are things that Congress could change. Congress could change the charitable deduction, make it a tax credit, limit it to $5,000 or whatever. You don't have to reward this kind of philanthropy.
We could also say that for every dollar you make over, I don't know, 3 million, 90% of it goes to the U.S. government, like essentially like it did. I mean, this is what the tax rate was in the 50s, in the 60s, right? I mean, it was at that point, it was like $450,000. If you made more than that in a year, your tax rate was 90%. That's, I think, 3 million is pretty close to what 400,000 was. I mean, there's a precedent in this country. I mean, it's conceptually it works. I don't know that we have the politics to get that to happen in this country, but as a policy, if we're going to throw around policies, that to me seems like the best option.
Yeah, well, it's not either or. People could still give even if they're being taxed highly. I think one thing you hear from wealthy people all the time is, well, the government is not very good at like they make lousy charity, right? So, well, the government isn't a charity. That's not what the government does. It's not supposed to do. I mean, it's a false comparison.
I would also argue that every human endeavor is has a similar failure rate to governments. I mean, where is this is also part of it too. You have this COVAX that has unequivocally failed. It has unequivocally failed in meeting the goal of 20% vaccination for the poor in the world. You see what's happening in India. It has unequivocally failed, but yet that's not the headline. There is no talk about that. There is no accountability. And if we were to judge, it's easy to judge the government. Go to the DMV. Well, the DMV actually does quite well. I've been to the DMV, fairly often, and I'm just as pleased with that as I am with the cable company, or I don't know, ending the subscription. From something I signed up for months ago. I mean, that is, it seems to me too, is part of that problem. And
well, Sam, you believe in government, right? But the Republican Party has been attacking the idea of government for decades, and it rubs off on a lot of people. Not only that, I don't know if you read Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk. It's a great book about kind of what the government really does that you've never heard of. And he's a fabulous writer. But one thing that sort of stood out to me is like, there's actually a lot of government agencies that are not allowed by statute. And this is because Congress, some members of Congress have made this happen. They're not allowed to sort of toot their own horn and say, here's what we do, and put out some public, positive public relations about it. Whereas the billionaire who does whatever has a PR team promoting it to all the media and so forth. So government is easy to hate, and it doesn't have much of a capacity to defend itself.
Well, it's a fascinating exploration into the minds, at least of those who are willing to talk to you about this. And I think it's something that we need as a society, more awareness. Michael Mechanic, the book is Jackpot: How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.